these big mega projects. We're going to go out in Siberia. We're going to spend 10 years spending dozens of billions of dollars. And then 5 to 6 years from now, I mean, that's how a lot of Russian oil is produced. Why do that anymore? Because you've just got all these yahoos in Texas who on 3 months' notice can be like, okay, I'll build some more spreads and blah.
Hello and welcome to the More Freedom Foundation podcast. I'm Murray, in charge of podcasting, and in charge of politics is Robert Morris. How are you this week?
Oh, not bad. I'm in a pretty good mood. After this, I get to go hang out with all my college buddies. We're having a reunion.
That sounds brilliant. That should be fun.
Oh yeah, it will be. It's actually in our the university town we went to in Ann Arbor. Typically when we get together, it's somewhere else, but now it's a big group of us going back to our old stomping grounds, and it should be pretty amusing. So
it's just your friends. It's not like organized by like the college or anything.
It's organized by our athletic team, which is sort of a smaller unit of college stuff. So it's really organized by us. So it's us just sort of descending on a random weekend and being a bunch of middle-aged dudes, a bunch of large middle-aged dudes. Should be great.
That sounds wonderful.
Yeah. Should be a good time.
I'm just very, I'm thinking about investing, Rob. I know you know a lot about this, and I'm thinking oil's coming back. You know, people are criticizing it a lot, and I think it's time to put a lot of money into oil. What do you think about that?
That's what you're thinking. Well, I got to say, Rory, that would not be my choice, to put it lightly.
Oil always wins, and the oil age will never end.
It's true. The oil prices just naturally go up. And I think that's one of the things I want to talk about today is that we have really for the past decade, we've been sitting in an oil market where I've been pretty consistently saying these prices are going to go down. And that is what they have done. And I have been amazed at how many brilliant professional people have been able to continue to fool themselves into thinking
Warren Buffett's never wrong.
That's certainly not true. Warren Buffett is, as I think he would proudly tell you, what makes a great investor is being right more often than you are wrong. And when it comes to Warren Buffett,
getting a handful of ones very right.
Yes. And Warren Buffett has gotten a lot very right. His recent bets on oil and gas companies have not been one of those. Though actually, I mean, oil and gas is a much better business today than it was 5 years ago. That is something that has changed over the course of time when I've been analyzing this. Some people have realized that you actually need to make money in the oil and gas industry. Those folks are primarily U.S. companies who have driven the cost of production lower and lower and lower and lower. For all of my adult life, up until the mid-20-teens, it was just known that Saudi Arabia produced oil more cheaply than the United States, North America, anybody else.
They did have natural advantages, as in the oil's just higher quality, so they can make
quality,
money from a lower price.
Higher quality, easier to access, and that's still true. They still do have I believe, the lowest cost of extraction. The thing is that over the past 10 years and over the past 5 years, specifically, U.S. and other North American producers have figured out how to get much, much, much closer to Saudi cost of extraction. And that is frankly, a mortal threat to really the whole oil industry, to be quite honest. But basically what I want to do today is I want to actually do a sort of brief history of the oil price to signify sort of to milepost, to milestone, how it is about to become irrelevant. Because for all of my life, really, since the 1970s, the oil price has been one of the most important dynamics in the world economy. Whether oil was cheap or expensive or predictable or volatile, determined really everything. There are obviously tremendous, as you started out at the top talking about, tremendous investment implications for everybody. And for the entire time, and it still is for me, even though it probably shouldn't be, it's just sort of a knee-jerk thing that I do, is I check the oil price every morning. That's the first thing I check every day to see what's going on. And that era is closing.
Can I just ask a question about U.S. oil prices? How much would it cost you to fill up a tank of gas?
Oh, it depends. There's wide
Because I remember
variation.
hearing someone criticizing the Democrats and basically saying this is terrible, $5 to fill a tank, and I was like, "Are you crazy? Is that would that be a roundabout?"
No, that's absolutely incorrect. What is crazy is that people get really, really angry over gallons of gas costing more than $3. So I'd say I think in most of the country, a gallon of gas has fallen under $3, and a gallon of gas is, I did this math recently, it's a couple liters or something along those lines.
One irritating issue with Imperial is there's multiple. So the UK has Imperial. I think it's based on like the beer Imperial, and America uses the wine Imperial. So it gets confusing, but we do buy fuel in liters.
And I think you guys pay what, $7 for a liter or something?
To fill a tank could be £100 now.
Yeah, 100 pounds. That's like still $120, $130. So it depends on the size of your gas tank. Of course, what makes it even more complicated is U.S. gas tanks tend to be a lot larger, because I was just driving in Europe, and it's amazing how tiny all the cars are over there.
And we think our cars are getting bigger.
They are. I documented that. I was driving in Italy, and I was shocked, honestly. They gave me, it was tiny. By U.S. standards, it was tiny. But the rental car company gave me what was essentially...
the biggest car they had.
It was the biggest car I'd certainly seen in Europe. It was an SUV of sorts. It was, it's tiny, but it was by U.S. standards. But it was quite something. To fill a tank of gas in the United States is anywhere between $40 and $80, I would say. And if it were more towards $80, people would be getting incensed. But the measure that is politically important, because how much it costs to fill a tank is so variable depending on what you're driving, is what a gallon of gas costs. That is not, in fact, what we're going to be talking about today. What we're going to be talking about today is the price of a barrel of oil.
Mm-hmm. A barrel of Brent crude, is it usually described as? Because when you look at oil prices, there seems to be like 700, and you're like, what is going on?
The two main ones are Brent and WTI. Brent, I believe, is based on some kind of Norwegian measure, but we generally understand that to be the price that people are paying in the old world, or like that's how I understand it, and perhaps that's incorrect. But I say Brent is sort of a little more on the nose for Middle Eastern producers who are primarily supplying Europe. So they're competing with Norway. WTI, West Texas Intermediate, is more the North American price. But they don't vary that much. Certainly for the past decade, when I've been looking at these prices closely, WTI has regularly been $2 to $4 to $5 less than Brent. So as of today, I believe Brent is sitting at, so WTI, the American price, is at about $72, and Brent crude is at about $74. So that differential is pretty normal. What I think is important to talk about before we embark upon this is when we're talking about historical prices for a barrel of oil, if you're an oil trader or something and you remember what those prices were, the numbers are going to seem very inaccurate because a U.S. dollar is worth a lot less than it used to be worth. And so if you're going to seriously talk about historical oil prices, you kind of need to talk about current dollars if you want to make any sense at all. So if you look at a historical chart of oil prices, they will say that in 2008, the highest price for oil prices we ever had, this is obviously before the financial crisis, during the China shock, a barrel cost $200. Now, at that point, that did not cost $200 because dollars were worth a lot more. But that is sort of the highest price that has ever been hit. To give you an indication of just how bad things are today, for pretty much from 2005 or so to 2014 or so, prices were regularly between $100 and $140 a barrel. Those were the normal prices. Since 2014, very rarely has the price broken $100, and only for a brief period of time. Probably the oil market shift that folks remember the best at this point would be in 2022, when oil prices spiked massively. They spiked up to $120 a barrel. But if you look at a historical record, which you can just Google, historic oil prices, you look at that, and when you look at it adjusted for inflation, you realize that massive, incredible spike in February of 2022 and lasting for a couple months in 2022 was only up to where the levels of prices normally were between 2005 and 2014, which gives you an indication of just how much trouble these oil and gas companies are
also, when you consider at the moment a lot of pagers are exploding and new escalation in war could happen and oil prices are just a bit like meh.
Yeah, it's absolutely extraordinary. I think probably we're not recording an episode right now on the likelihood of war between Israel and Lebanon because we've cried wolf so many, or I have cried wolf so many times at this point that I guess we'll talk about it if it happens. Of course, by the time this is up 2 weeks from now, it could very well
it's very possible. Another thing I was going to say, just to give a bit of context of how much the dollar was worth. So $1 in 1950 would be worth, today's dollar would be worth $13 back then, if that makes sense. So, obviously the further we go up, the less magnitudes they will be. But yeah, that obviously, what's that, 13 times it's changed? 13, a magnitude of 13 since the 50s, and then as things go on, they become less. So as we'll know, the dollar is essentially worth very little than for historical prices, which is what we'll be mostly talking about.
And to be clear, I'm not somebody who is, super worried about that, with the exception of the period of the 2020s. That's just been a very slow, and also, of course, the 1970s. That's been a very slow, gradual uptick. Inflation is normal. It's not something to get too concerned about, but it is something you have to pay attention to if you want to talk about the way that the oil market has changed. Now, that also vitally applies to gas prices. So people are angry at Joe Biden over current gas prices, in part because they aren't doing this math. They remember, when they were a kid or 10, 15 years ago, a gallon of gas was always under $1.50 or what have you.
Are you getting to that age yet where you go?
Well, as we'll cover, my time in high school was one of the incredible low points of the oil and gas market. So I remember paying, I think it might have actually broken $1 for it. So under $1 for a gallon of gas, I think, when I was in high school in the late 1990s. So yeah, I mean, I guess I've got the mindset, or at least I've got the historical data to be among the worst.
So things have only nearly doubled since then.
Oh no, over tripled. So I hear.
Oh no, I'm talking about inflation, like what $1 would be worth. So 190 is what is what $1 would be worth in 1998.
Oh, that's interesting. Anyway, we can get caught up in this math forever, and I'm sure not very interesting for people. But what I think is interesting, and I think I've emphasized this recently in a podcast and in a live video, and I definitely want to do some produced videos about it because I think it is vitally important, is just how all important energy prices have been. If you look at this, I'm looking at you just easily Googled a 70-year history chart. It goes back to 1940s or so. And you can just look at this chart, and it is easy, and it is flat, and it is cheap at around $30 a barrel in current prices, and actually diminishing pretty much from the 50s to the early 1970s. And that is an incredible sweet spot for development for everybody. I don't know, actually, if in the Irish context this is so much the case, but for most of Western Europe...
Yeah, well, for a long time, Ireland was considered the sort of poor man of Europe, or definitely like one of the poorest countries in the richest region.
Yeah, but for the 30 years between World War II and the early 1970s are recalled throughout Western Europe and in the United States as the best term for it, of course, would be the French term, the Trente Glorieuses. The Glorious 30, 3 magnificent decades of economic development. This is probably what most of the MAGA people, the Make America Great people, are talking about, that extraordinary era of profitability and ease and wealth. And it wasn't just the developed world. The few colonized countries that were lucky enough to be independent by that point were also having a pretty good time. We're also going from strength to strength. We're able to grow. It was pretty magical, and it's pretty great for everything when energy prices more broadly are low and consistent. And again, during this period, this magical period from the 1950s to the 1970s, energy costs were just regularly going down, which is kind of extraordinary. What changed that was the oil crisis in 1973. As I think I've said this before, I'm not sure I've said this before on the podcast, it's worth reiterating. I've just been struck in recent years, no matter what history I'm reading, the 1973 oil crisis is a disaster for that country. Actually, Yemen, it's not. I've been doing a lot of Yemen recently. It's not, because Yemen is very connected to the Saudi Arabian context, economically speaking. So actually, the 70s were amazing. The oil crisis is really good for oil producing for a petrostate like Saudi Arabia, and Yemen sort of went along in its slipstream. But across Africa, newly independent countries, most of Africa didn't gain independence until the 1960s. And they had about a decade of it kind of working out all right, and then were smashed.
Well, it's also the decade is like the hardest time when you first get independence.
Yeah.
So they got a bit of time when things were still difficult for them, and then, as you say, they get hit in the face with everything going wrong.
And it's not just an excuse for failure in non-developed countries. The whole Reagan, Thatcher, hatred of government, neoliberal business fundamentalism thing, I don't think any of that really happens without the oil crisis. It's interesting, like just when I was taught history and learn about the end of the New Deal era, it's like, well, the New Deal era just ran out of steam and they realized that all of this was kind of a failure, and it just seemed natural to turn to business. And of course, Vietnam had a lot to do with it. And it's stunning how unwilling a lot of people are to concede that the whole switch in Europe and the United States to pro-business fundamentalism was a direct result of perceived failures of the older model because of the oil crisis. So it's tremendously significant. I was reading the history of India recently, amazing democratic legacy stretching from 1947 until today, except for the mid to late 1970s when they fell into authoritarianism because of the pressures of the oil crisis. I can do this over and over and over again. And I think I'll talk about how, honestly, it's the oil price that ended the Cold War more than anything else, but we'll get to that historically.
It's also seen as the start of a lot of environmentalism, because they're sort of saying that we need to sort of move away from this commodity that might go away one day.
Well, that was, in some ways, that was tremendously effective and actually did lead to another period of low and predictable oil prices in the 1980s and the early 1990s and into the 1990s. When I was in high school. That led to some very positive stuff.
And Europe's love affair with diesel.
Yes, that's true. That too, which is dirtier in some ways, right? But it's more efficient.
Yes, it has less CO2, but it has more NOx and SOx, so you'll get a lot more like conditions like asthma and stuff, especially in big cities.
Oh, gross.
So no, but it's the fact that when you make gasoline, you also make diesel. They all kind of evaporate off when you do the process. So you can't just only get one. You just get them all. So it just meant you had a surplus of one oil, and they're like, might as well use it.
Yeah, just worth signposting because you mentioned it. The incredible complexity of what we're talking about, oil and gas markets, is something we're not even beginning.
Just when you look at an oil refinery, all you see is steel tubes everywhere and steam coming out, and you're like, I have no idea what's going on. It's very complicated.
And then maybe we'll get a little into, natural gas, which seems to sometimes be harvested by itself, is sometimes a byproduct of oil production. Yeah. It's all infinitely complex, but these prices...
I think you always get natural gas from oil, but you don't always get oil from natural gas, because I think it sort of happens over time. So if it's left long enough, it'll have all turned into natural gas.
So I just want to briefly signpost that while looking at this graph of oil prices, we are dramatically oversimplifying things, and we're going to just go back to oversimplifying things, because I think it's useful for the story we're trying to tell here today. 1973 oil crisis, as I think people will no doubt be aware, I've gone from not wanting to talk about Israel to being pretty a lot less sympathetic to Israel than I used to be. So it would be very...
nearly everybody is.
Yes, I think that's a kind of a universal thing, and is why there are people working so desperately hard to legislate against it in the United States. That is not what I want to talk about today. So it'd actually be very easy to blame what happened in 1973 on Israel, but I actually don't think that's fair. what happened, the launch of the oil crisis was there was a war in 1973. The United States is generally perceived to have saved Israel in that war. It did not go as straightforwardly well for them as the 1967 conflict had gone. Saudi Arabia, I think primarily, and some other oil producers were really angry at the United States for saving Israel in this conflict, whether or not that's actually what happened, declared an embargo. And instantly, the prices shot through the roof. I don't know. I mean, Rory, you're about 5 years younger than I am. Do you have a cultural memory, or do you have like family members who told you about what happened in the 1970s? Because
not really. Well, the troubles would have been going on here, so I feel like that was just a small backdrop, the oil crisis, maybe. So no, I don't really have much cultural or lived memory of the oil crisis, I'm afraid.
It's tremendously significant in the United States. Yeah. So I am not that old. I was born actually in the second wave of the oil crisis in 1979, which we will get to. But it is something that just keeps going on, and it was for the American consumer at writ large, the American citizenry. It was a tremendous shock, and the mental picture we have is people lining up at gas stations, having to line up for gas, having to pay extraordinary amounts of money for gas.
Do you think it left a mental scar like the Depression did, as in something that we can sort of have some control over and we need to make sure never happens again?
Absolutely. And there's, even Republicans are open to a lot. Even Republicans, even during the height of Reaganism, were always open to a little more government intervention if it meant making sure that what had happened in the 1970s, I believe twice in the 1970s, in 1973 and 1979, never letting that happen again. And that was actually largely successful effort, even by the 1980s. So this is just a big, big deal. And there was a recent film, I can't remember, he's one of those pretentious filmmakers, and he usually makes bigger stuff, but he made a sort of
small scale?
He usually makes more weighty stuff, but this was like a coming of age romance between, I think it was like a young woman and then a guy in high school. I don't know, Licorice Pizza or something. Fun little movie, but the backdrop of this movie that came out in the early 2020s was very much the oil crisis and the lines for gas, and it was just part of the story, and it's a real touchstone in the United States, because in an era of absurd plenty, where everything was on offer and everything was easy, all of a sudden things came to a screeching halt.
Mm-hmm. But we are in the oil age. Like nearly everything is, I'm sure sometimes it's exaggerated, but when you consider how much food is reliant on oil, like apples are covered in edible oil to preserve them. So much oil is required in fertilizer. I'm surrounded by plastic. A lot of energy is still produced by natural gas, which is, closely related to oil. Like, everything is funding.
Well, a lot of plastic is natural gas now because there's been so much natural gas produced, and it's irritating. So it's one of my favorite, something I really shouldn't be consuming anymore in my 40s, but I love this brand of Snapple iced tea, which is, I think, might be a little more East Coast in the United States broadly, but it's just this disgustingly sugary concoction that I used to love to have with my Camel Lights in high school. And up until about 5 years ago, it was always provided in this iconic glass bottle. But because natural gas is so cheap now, Snapple switched over wholesale from this iconic glass bottle to plastic.
Glass can be infinitely recycled, and plastic is a bit...
it really can't be recycled
it a bit on a very good day if everything goes well.
Yeah, and it's also not...
But it is super cheap.
It's super cheap to make and just put in the landfill, which is the vast majority
or the sea.
Of it. Yeah, or the sea, indeed. However, just back to that point on Israel, I think that it's tempting, especially in this new environment where everyone's waking up to, how awful Israel can be, to say, this is, Israel did this to us. And I think that's BS. That's not true. What happened, this was the crisis that highlighted something that had happened. From the formation of the oil industry, when they started taking oil out of the ground, and it killed the whaling industry because it wasn't initially for automobiles; it was for kerosene lamps, which were safer and cleaner than the whale oil that had been used for lamps up to that point. So since the dawn of the oil industry in the late 1800s, the United States had been by far the largest producer and had also been the largest exporter and had produced vastly more than it ever needed. And then at some point in the late 60s, early 1970s, that line between U.S. production and U.S. consumption crossed. From the 1970s until the 2010s, the United States, the biggest market, biggest consumer of everything, up until China surpassed us on a number of metrics in the 2010s, all of a sudden started needing that Middle East oil that had, mostly just been supplying Europe and Asia up to that, Europe and Japan, really, up until that point. And the market fundamentally shifted. And the 1973 oil crisis, the Yom Kippur War, that was just a sort of catalyst to highlight what had already been happening. So that what really mattered is that flip in the market. What's kind of extraordinary is I haven't read this recently. I should probably double check this, but I'm pretty sure there was actually an oil embargo in 1967 as well. That Saudi Arabia and Iran did the same thing, and it was bad for Europe. It had an impact on British economy and British politics. I recall that. That's in the context in which I was reading about it. But the United States didn't care. We're like, whatever. It made no impact because we were mostly
self-sufficient,
just consuming our own. But what changed between 1967, 68, and 1973 was the United States was no longer self-sufficient and had started vacuuming up all this production. So honestly, the 1973 crisis had a much bigger impact than Saudi Arabia was expecting. And that's what launched the modern oil market. That's what made the oil price the most important factor in everything for my entire life up until the mid-2000s. And sort of, I think what more and more, the reason we're recording this podcast now is I think that more and more people are coming to the realization that in fact the oil price is no longer the most important thing. In fact, we are not running out of oil and gas. In fact, you are not a guaranteed winner if you participate in the oil and gas market. And this is a really tremendous, tremendous switch, which is worth paying attention to.
Is it still wanting more oil year on year, or because we constantly talk about China, or is America basically is a bit like, I have enough oil now, I don't need to expand and get more?
That's interesting. I think I think every market continues to grow every year in what it consumes, but what's really important is the rate at which it grows. The kind of the disaster in the world oil markets this year is that in 2023, China did dramatically expand its oil consumption with reopening. Everybody was happy. Everybody expected that to continue at a slightly lower level this year. And the Chinese oil consumption is still growing. It's just growing at a vastly smaller rate than was expected. And that is why the bottom has dropped out of oil prices.
It does seem like America has plateaued. It hasn't really reached highs from like 2003.
Really?
Which is hard to believe, but...
Yeah, so you're looking at that right now?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, fascinating. Well, that's good to know.
It's just sort of plateaued. So yeah, maybe everyone's looking towards China for expansion, and the fact we're seeing Australia its economy's dwindling a bit, which is quite often joked that it's just an open cast mine for China, which suggests China's maybe economically not buying as much, but also possibly moving away.
Yep, it's fascinating, and I'm pretty sure that oil and gas consumption in China is still growing, but it is growing at a much, much, much smaller rate.
Also, a bit like America, they do have large supplies, nowhere near as large as America, but it's enough is it about 20% of its demand?
It's fascinating watching China's economy shift. We're in this weird point where people are waking up to, haven't quite internalized the fact that, but by the end of the decade, China is, if current trends continue, China's going to be able to quite legitimately lecture the United States on climate stuff, which is...
Well, I keep thinking of Britain. When it first started, it was incredibly dirty and used a lot of coal, and its cities were so bad it had introduced new policies to reduce coal because fog was just incredibly dense and people died. And well, China did exactly the same thing. It had a massive expansion moment. It used a lot of dirty coal. and now it's slowly transitioning to something that doesn't mean it has to rely on the outside world as much.
Yeah. Yeah, and in China, to be clear, China still has much higher pollution problems.
I remember seeing some B-roll. There was a YouTuber I was watching, they had B-roll of Chinese coal, and it was just like something out of a sci-fi thing, because it's just as far as the horizon could see, giant football stadium size worth of coal, and there was just about 20, 30, 40 of these. So yeah, China's definitely got a lot of coal and is very happy to use it.
Yeah. And that is bad for the environment.
Oh, yeah, it's terrible.
When you consider what China's doing with electric vehicles and solar more broadly, it is. It's about to steal a real march on the United States as the climate leader. We just sort of assume in the United States that, if there's a Republican in power, nobody in the world is doing anything about climate because we're the only people whose decisions matter. China is in the process of disproving us on that point.
But it's mostly just for their own security.
100%. Yeah, no, but that's the beauty of it. China has, and the real problem of the decade to come is that the United States, because of shale, has become, frankly, just a petrostate more and more.
Okay, because I'm not saying America has this. America as a country should never write off, but there's a thing called Dutch syndrome, where basically I think the Netherlands found like one of Europe's largest deposits of gas outside of Russia. And this was incredible for the Netherlands, but it meant that then everyone could get a job in gas. So it meant you didn't want to be an artist. You didn't want to, strive in anything else. It's like, you can just get a really good job doing very little in the gas industry. So it can is
that what the Dutch syndrome means? I'd always heard the term. I didn't.
Okay, that's always been my interpretation. Is like everyone just gets easy money, an easy job, and it can kind of make the economy less dynamic. And what we've found is that it's best to have a very dynamic economy, much like America. So when one industry fails, have you looked it up and found I'm completely wrong?
No, it's the apparent causal relationship between the increase in the economic development of a specific sector, i.e. natural resources, and a decline in other sectors. So yeah, Dutch disease is important. And I think that's actually, that's real. But I think it's got even more pernicious aspect for the United States is that...
Well, I think Saudi Arabia would be like the complete basket case of this. Like, other than they're just throwing petrol money at something, like golfers, like what do you care about Saudi Arabia for?
Well, what's so horrifying is that because these oil and gas incumbents have made so much money and are trying to defend themselves and defend their market, is they are keeping the United States from getting involved in a big way in markets like solar and electric vehicles, to the point where China is now way out ahead of us.
Well, it completely destroyed the German solar industry. And it may do the same with its car industry. Like Volkswagen is worried.
Yeah. Well, no, but I just want to speak specifically to the fact that oil companies in the United States still, I don't think they're a lot more careful now about funding people who are denying climate change, or at least the big companies are. But they're still funding people who are saying, solar's really dirty. And, electric vehicles are just as polluting as internal combustion engines. And they're funding studies that say this just horseshit.
Oh, yeah. I just find it funny that a lot of these conspiracy theorist types are always anti-electric car. And you're like, well, you're just helping Saudi Arabia, which is a country that chops people's hands off for bad tweets. Like... Of all the sort of conspiracy theory things you could pull, it's like, just point to Saudi Arabia and most people will believe you. Like, I just find it strange that so many of them are like, we've got to defend big oil.
Oh, and more specifically there.
But with the, was it the American media personalities that were found out to be being paid by Russia? Like, I think we only found out about that because the paperwork wasn't done correctly. Like, you can sort of criticize Ukraine and say Russia's great as long as the paperwork's fine. So what people were pointing out, that a lot of people are probably on the payroll of Saudi Arabia, but we just don't know because they've done the paperwork right.
No, I mean, I think it is, that's a very large separate issue. I think, frankly, we just don't scrutinize the Gulf money or the Israeli money the European money. There's a ton of money that comes from places like Norway. I hadn't really thought about that angle, but like Norway has an interest in I don't think they'd certainly do this in Europe, but in the United States, they have an interest in killing U.S. nuclear and U.S. Environmental stuff. One of the great right-wing bugaboos, things they love to complain about is, environmentalists killed the nuclear industry in the United States, which totally happened. But who do you think funded the environmentalists? You think a bunch of hippies just sort of naturally got themselves onto the nightly news in an environment where there were only 3 broadcast networks in the United States back in the 1970s and 1980s? Hell no. It's because the board members on NBC, ABC, and CBS were board members at Exxon and the other places. I think my broader point is just that the oil companies have done tremendous damage, following up on the Dutch disease that you're talking about, by just frankly funding people who are just lying to the American people. If I go to Thanksgiving, I'll sit down with some broadly pretty informed relatives who will be like, but don't you know that, solar panels are a terrible environmental blight? And it's just like, and then I took the time once to sort of check down who that was coming from and who was saying that. And it's all BS. Like it's just nonsense.
It's also, I think there's solar panels that are 30 years old that are still outputting like 70%.
Yeah. No, it's like comparing the environmental damage.
Oh yeah, they're outstanding. Like try to recycle your diesel.
Yeah, comparing, I think it's something ridiculous. Like, a single coal mine causes more environmental damage than like all of the solar production of a year or something along the lines. So yeah, no, it's risible. It sounds like nonsense, and it actually is nonsense. But oil industries pay for enough respectable guys in suits to stand up and say stuff like that, and it's still a factor. But
quite often it can just be a delaying tactic. Like with smoking, it's like if we get another 10 years, that'd be great. Do you know what I mean? So it's like if we can delay electric cars a wee bit more, that'll be great. And I've also heard they're trying to push like a very inefficient, small, cheap car in the developing world, because quite often electric is more appealing to the developing world because you maybe don't have the same petrol infrastructure, but electric can be a bit more sporadic, but you can get a bit of charge. And they may also have a lot of wind and solar, which could power this.
That's the thing is that Detroit Detroit is the U.S. car industry, because they listen to these oil executives and their PR machines. Detroit's just going to lose the entire developing world to Chinese electric cars, and it's a real tragedy. But we're falling off of what I wanted to do, sort of the history of the oil price. So in 1973, we have the initial oil crisis. Then in 1979, with the fall of the Shah of Iran, we have another oil crisis, and this is interesting. You talk about the failure of Jimmy Carter, our famous one-term president. It depends on who you talk to a lot, and he was probably both, but a lot of people talk about him as sort of the harbinger of, he was the first neoliberal Reaganite president, really, because of some of the things he tried, or he was the last sort of New Deal, old school, believes in government president, or what have you. But he was a failure because of the 1979 oil crisis. He of course looked weak because of the Iran hostage crisis and whatnot. But fundamentally, the economy was just cooked. So
I'm thinking of the classic, it's just the economy, stupid. Like quite often if people don't feel like things are going well, I'll vote for the other guy. So
across the 1970s, the United States and the United States was the richest country in the world at that point. So really every country in the world just went through the 1970s experiencing these tremendously negative impacts, unless they were already a petrostate. So then we get to the 1980s, and what's interesting is that you were talking about how Europe's love affair with diesel. The United States did not fall in love with diesel, but we did fall in love with efficiency. Those incredible cars from the 1950s. I don't know if you guys have classic. No,
I can imagine like the likes of Cadillacs and stuff.
Yeah, just these absurd monstrosities with the fins and the this, that, and the other thing. You go to a classic car thing, and they're still enormous. They're still bigger than most SUVs. They are like, it's just absurd. Absolutely, through gaming classifications in the 1990s into the 2000s, teens and 20s, the United States has fallen off on this a lot because of SUVs, sport and utility vehicles or whatnot that are not technically cars or something, so that allows them to have worse fuel efficiency.
Yes, sir.
But in the 1970s, under Nixon, under Ford, under Carter, and even in the 1980s under Reagan, because this was something that was focused on, there was a massive, massive, massive drive towards efficiency, towards using less oil. And it was completely successful if you look at this historic oil price chart. Not completely successful. Things were still volatile. Things were still really difficult, and choppy if you were a developing country. But for a developed country, the 1980s, the 1990s looked pretty good on the energy front because prices were sort of consistently lower. Of course, they weren't as low.
And vehicles are more efficient.
Exactly.
Well, so I'm thinking of the AMC Gremlin, which has like a 4-liter engine, and it was just horrendously inefficient. And that was built at the start of the 70s when everything was still good. And yeah, engine sizes became smaller and they just became a lot more efficient. The Japanese moved in, European stuff became more popular.
Yep, and that's and prices went down because of that efficiency. I think there's a certain kind of analysis that's right-wing coded, which is, it's all shale, it's all Texas drillers finding out how to get more oil and gas. But actually, in the 1980s, the United States and Europe figured out how to and Japan, of course, figured out how to have cheaper oil prices again. Not as cheap as we're about to have, but cheaper oil prices again, solely through legislating efficiency. And I think that's a really important thing to realize. And so because in the 1980s, we were still, not as much as we were in the China shock era of the sort of 2000s, but people were still pretty convinced that peak oil was a thing, that we were really going to run out of oil. But we did manage to, even in that context, get the prices to be consistently lower during a decade when Iraq and Iran, two of the biggest producers of that day, were fighting each other the whole decade. So I think while we have been for the past decade in kind of a magical period of lower prices, and we've got a lot of technological reasons why we're going to continue in a lower price environment, it's important to remember that in the 1980s, just through good governments, some sound regulation, and businesses that did what they had to do, we actually managed to get to much lower oil prices. So to the point where I could be in high school and get a gallon of gas for, I really do think it was under $1 briefly. It actually broke $1.
That's incredible.
Yeah, or maybe it really only broke $2. I don't know, but it was a lot lower than it was today. What happened after that? China shock. And if you're looking at this price graph, you can see how, especially, but pretty much from the Asian financial crisis, the big dip here in 1997, 1998. I assume that's the Asian financial crisis. Yeah, that's got to be the Asian financial crisis, when Japan, Korea, a whole bunch of countries that were not as big a factor as they are today went through massive economic trauma.
Well, similar things that we're worried about, that we're currently worrying about China, we're worried about with Japan, and some eerily similar things like America being a bit lazy on cars, and then China just going, well, I'll just sell cars to the rest of the world, and if you're not going to take mine.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it was there are a lot of
and then
a lot of echoes.
Find out there's quite often a lot of hot air with any suddenly rising country or company.
Yeah. So with the Asian financial crisis in the 90s, oil and gas prices, yes, of course. This is when I was finishing high school. This is that point at which 1998, at which I was filling my gas tank for under $1 a gallon, was the Asian financial. So, but from the Asian financial crisis in 1998 up until 2014, so a solid 16 years there, oil prices just went up. And that is the genesis of this delusion that we're finally seeing dissipate in recent weeks and months. And actually, I have actual empirical basis for this.
So yeah, 1990 was pretty much like $1.1, so $1.10 per gallon.
Really?
Would that be right?
1990, it says?
Yeah, 1991. But yeah, it did dip down to 1.3 in 1998.
1998, all right. So keep in mind, though, is that inflation? Is that in today's dollars?
That's in both. It'll be close to $2 in today's money.
Huh, interesting. Then maybe it was just that it fell under $1.50. I don't know.
Oh, yeah, no, but I'm sure some stations would have sold it cheaper. This is just like an average. Do you know what I mean?
Never knows. One never knows. But I crucially, like what's been happening the past couple weeks, I'm talking about this delusion that started forming because of the China shock and how it has dissipated. This is a Bloomberg article from 6 days ago. hedge funds have never been this bearish on Brent crude before. So essentially, hedge funds turned net bearish on Brent crude for the first time on record. So essentially, for the first time ever, Wall Street is betting that prices are going to go lower. So what we're saying is that essentially
everyone's betting against it
over the past weeks, for the first time since this has been recorded. Of course, I believe this particular statistic has only been recorded since the 90s or the aughts or whatever. But still, it's kind of insane. That it does seem that the market has finally woken up to something that we've been talking about here at the More Freedom Foundation for 8 years now, which is that oil prices are just going to be lower. And this delusion that everybody was so mired in comes out of this period from 1998 to 2014, where no matter what happened, oil prices went up because of China, because that was the great point of the China shock. It's worth pointing out what happened to the Soviet Union. It is tremendously difficult for a country that has fallen into Dutch disease, who's become tremendously reliant, this is a risk for the United States now, on one commodity, to actually have a price spike. It's really bad news, because the price spike, especially a sustained price spike, will convince everybody in your country that the happy days are going to be here forever. Wall Street has been really deluded on the price of, by Wall Street, I mean U.S. finance people, U.S. industry has been really deluded on the topic of the oil and gas price for about 20 years now. Saudi Arabia, Russia, Algeria, Nigeria, places that produce oil, this delusion is tremendously more dangerous. The incredible example of how bad an oil price spike can be for a petrostate, the canonical example, I would argue, is the Soviet Union.
Okay.
A lot of people want to credit Ronald Reagan's defense buildup. A lot of people want to credit Afghanistan. A lot of explanations. Chernobyl, sure. A lot of explanations for why the Soviets, but actually Chernobyl I would argue, can to some extent be explained by the oil price. So even in the 1970s, the Soviet Union was becoming a huge, huge producer of oil and gas. I think the big pipelines were built in the early 80s. The big pipelines to Europe, or the first big pipelines to Europe, were built in the 1980s, even during the Cold War, which the Reagan administration was really angry about. So the 1970s were really, really good for the Soviet Union because of this oil crisis. All of a sudden, I think it's argued that, and of course the Soviet Union was such a sick system, a lot of this bounty was used to finally, for the first time, catch up to producing as many nuclear weapons as the United States did. But there was enough left over for the Soviet economy in general to experience kind of good times. These were a period of stagnation. This was Brezhnev, things weren't going great. But they were going kind of okay, and there was money left over to do things. And in 1979, because they were so well funded because of the oil crisis, because they were doing so well as a petrostate, the Soviets made the historical blunder of going into Afghanistan. By the mid-'80s, looking at this graph, certainly by 1985, all of a sudden, there was a huge drop in 1985.
Yeah, so from 1981 to 1985 is quite catastrophic, and then it keeps on going.
Exactly. So that's a very good point. You've got this just steady downward. 1980 hit a, not the largest peak, but I guess the second biggest peak on this map. $150 in today's dollars a barrel. By 1985. It was $80, almost half. And then in 1985, it went from $80 all the way down to $30, and then continued to spike and be volatile, but just really, really incredibly bleak for the Soviet. Oh, and actually, much like the 2014 to 2022 thing, there was a brief, really big spike when Iraq invaded Kuwait and the United States took out Iraq. In 1990, that's fascinating, because that's a lot like if you look at the 2014 to 2022 period, where 2014 prices fall off the cliff and then there's a brief spike because of Russia-Ukraine. I hadn't really noticed that before, that they really do sort of mimic each other. I hope everybody's looking at this graph at home, because otherwise this is going to sound, I'm afraid this might be a little boring. But regardless, across the 1980s, the Soviet Union lost that incredible cash cow, and it just kept diminishing and diminishing. And I wouldn't be surprised if it was that lack of cash that kept them from appropriately overseeing what they were doing in Chernobyl. So there you go.
And needing to rely more on nuclear.
Yeah. And well, but they just didn't have the money to adequately oversee, because they had to cut money everywhere. That's the context out of which you get Gorbachev and Glasnost and Perestroika is like, good God, everything is terrible. We don't have the easy money of the 1970s anymore. And that's one of the main, if not the main factor in the Soviet Union's breakup. So let's fast forward back again to the China shock. We have the China shock, and then we do finally have, for the right-wing interpretation, what truly destroyed the worldwide oil industry in 2014, which is Texas shale. It's not just Texas, it's Oklahoma, it's the Dakotas. But
it is an American expertise.
It is an American expertise that has really... I haven't done a produced video on oil for a while, and it was very much in the delusion era from 2012 all the way up until 2020. We were still, as an industry in the United States, we were focused on this idea that no matter how much oil you produce, somebody's going to buy it. It's going to be great. And God, what's fascinating actually is this, obviously under any measure, this is something that happened under Obama, which is not something that Trump likes to talk about. But really, no president actually deserves credit for this. But really, from 2012, the market was pretty oversupplied. And it was everybody just sort of assumed that no matter what, oil was going to be expensive. And that assumption alone kept oil expensive. And that's sort of a crucial thing. I think, honestly, even with the low prices of today, we're still in that world where the oil prices are keeping things more expensive than they should be, but the illusion is dissipating. As all the oil and gas boosters will tell you, in the late 2000s, innovations, call it fracking, call it, there's all kinds of things with applications beyond fracking. There is the canonical fracking, sort of pushing water into break formations. There's advances in directional drilling. There's a million different things that all came together to create this extraordinary bonanza in production. The bottom line is that the United States, we talked earlier about that point, at some point in the late 60s, early 1970s, where the United States started consuming more than it was producing. The United States now produces more than it consumes. There's an asterisk there with the incredible complexity of, there's what's coming in, what's going out. We still buy a lot of stuff because we have refineries in the United States, but most of the stuff we're buying is from Canada and Mexico. So it's all so easy. We're doing so well that we've gleefully, during the Trump administration, just destroyed the oil industry of Venezuela, which used to be a big supplier to the United States. We're in a post-scarcity environment in U.S. energy. And at the same time, China's economic miracle started to tail off. Really, in my mind, it's sort of 2015, 2016 is sort of at the point at which China's sort of more natural explosion had tailed off, and the stimulus spending in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis also tailed off. The United States started becoming self-sufficient in oil and gas production just at the same time that the China shock that had created this delusion of prices go up forever, you're always going to be able to sell oil, disappeared. And that's what happened in 2014. And you can see this. And I think it's pretty vital that people don't want to recognize this. There's this sort of ongoing, present bias for a lot of people who talk about markets, who talk about the oil and gas markets. But it's been a solid decade now of lower prices, and it's not getting better. Absolutely, in 2022, there was this sort of massive spike because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But what's
But also people would have been coming out of COVID as well, so that would have been like economies starting up. So you're getting like a double whammy effect.
Absolutely. And the supply chains, what that did to supply chains is how we got that burst of inflation. COVID plus Russia's invasion of Ukraine essentially injected inflation into the world markets for the first time since the 1970s, or massive inflation into the markets for the first time since the 1970s. That's sort of an indication of just how powerful the oil market is the way that it created the inflation that was such a dominating political issue in the United States. I would argue probably one last time. I wanted to really point out that 1980s efficiency thing, that without renewables, I think that period of the 1980s is when Carter put solar panels on the roof of the White House, but those panels that were up there were so laughably useless. They
were like brand new NASA technology, but yes, they would be abysmal today, and they cost an absolute fortune.
So in the 1980s, when renewables were not a factor, when the technological bonanza of the U.S. Oil production that we saw this century was barely a gleam in anybody's eye. A lot of that was computer-aided, and computers just weren't, much of a factor in the 1980s. With simple regulation and efficiency, we were actually able to get to pretty solid low oil prices. So the period going from here, and it's nice to see that Wall Street has finally woken up to something that we've been talking about here for 8 years. You've not just got the potential to do what we did in the 1980s, simple regulatory changes. You've got at the same time, and people like to oppose these things, but you've got them going at the same time, you've got an ongoing bonanza in North America. And this is key. Some of my videos talk a lot about how from 2012 to 2018, nobody actually made any money in the oil industry.
Was it a bit like tech, where they're like, oh, we'll throw money at this company, they'll dominate it with their technology, and then we'll make billions? Wow.
Exactly. That's what was happening. Yeah, that was what was happening. And the New York Times ran a story, I want to say it was in 2018 or so, talking about how $300 billion in investment had disappeared over a variety of companies, sure, but just in the U.S. North American oil and gas industry.
Who was investing? Because I assume it's not Saudi Arabia.
Everybody.
Okay.
Everybody. Because everybody just assumed
make oil, make money,
that eventually this is going to be worth something. So whether we're talking about pension funds, whether we're talking about retail investors, whether we're talking about, Exxon was the largest company in the world as recently as the 2000s, I believe. So it was just seen as a good bet. And it really, really wasn't. And by 2018...
But wasn't shale a lot more disparate? Like, you didn't have like big giant companies. It seems like you have a lot, almost mom and pop businesses, and they're hard to organize. You can't just say everyone make loads of oil or make little oil. Everyone's a bit like, I know better than you, and I'm going to make a buck.
Well, that is from 2012 to 2018. That is absolutely, they were the majority. They were the folks, and they were impossible to control. And as soon as the price went up above $60, they'd all just open more rigs and bring the price coming tumbling down. And that's the virtue of it. That's one of the beauties of the way that technology has moved forward, is that these big mega projects, we're going to go out in Siberia, we're going to spend 10 years spending dozens of billions of dollars, and then 5 to 6 years from now, we're going to, that's how a lot of Russian oil is produced. Why do that anymore? Because you've just got all these yahoos in Texas who on 3 months' notice can be like, okay, I'll build some more spreads and pop. So that is an ongoing dynamic, but there's been a really important shift. So I think it was New York Times. There's that New York Times article from 2018 that's like literally $300 billion has been pissed away and it's gone.
That's outstanding.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary amount of money. And the oil industry got the message. And they're actually very lucky because they got this message, and then the Russia-Ukraine thing happened. So you've seen a lot of stuff in 2022 talking about oil is back. Look at all this money they're making, this, that, and the other thing. because in 2018 or thereabouts, Wall Street cut them off. They were simply like, look, we're not going to keep giving you money if you stop. And what happened there, I think Saudi Arabia was pretty excited to see that, pretty happy to hear about that. Oh, phew, finally the crazy Yahoo era is over. And the crazy Yahoo era is over to an extent. There's massive consolidation. Some of the bigger little guy companies have gone out of business. A lot of them have been purchased. However, what happened when this sort of crazy Yahoo environment started trending more corporate and the Yahoos that were left started competing with the corporates is the cost of production actually plummeted. So $60 a barrel, and this was when $60 was a lot more money, was sort of the break-even price in the 2010s. Like if it went over above $60 a barrel, then the shale people would start, producing a lot more and bring the price back down. Now it's lower. I don't know what it is, but
it's also just the expertise America has, because it just seems like, as you talk about America as the blessed country, Europe's topography just isn't right. It seems like America's a lot flatter. So in the UK, they've tried it. They keep getting earthquakes. Weirdly, a lot of the gas is in the richer parts of England, which don't seem to get as much, while Newcastle, a poorer part, tends to get a lot of it. We had some they tried in Poland, didn't quite work out. So this is a fact that America's now been at this, 20 years? Like, we're now just getting nearly the second generation of people that have been fracking that are just coming up with such better techniques, cheaper techniques, more efficient techniques, and ultimately it makes an easier bottom line.
Yeah, and this expertise is being applied in Canada and the United States. And if we really were, this is why peak oil is never going to be the case. Like, if we do get to a point where all this expertise is being applied in Saudi Arabia, okay, then start getting worried. But the thing is, the oil market is so oversupplied that these advanced techniques just aren't going to end up ever being applied in these other places because we're never going to need oil and gas that much.
Could we ever see America go a bit like Norway, where Norway wants to use the least amount of oil as possible so it can sell the most? Will we see America ever get to that point where it's a bit like oil's for foreigners and we drive about in electric cars and don't really need it anymore?
I'd be surprised. Self-sacrifice is not a big factor in the United States, but it is interesting. I mean, Texas is the leader in wind and solar, as well as
Oh yeah, it's very laissez-faire. It can be a wee bit scary, their power grid. It seems like sometimes people have to pay a terrifying amount all of a sudden because they don't seem to have the same protections, and winter seems to scare any type of snow. The system seems to shut down a bit, but hey, if Texas is an experiment for the rest of the world, then I embrace it.
Yeah. ERCOT, the Texas grid, is not something that I fully understand, but would be worth doing a podcast on at some point.
So yeah, just for anyone that doesn't know, America has three grids, one on the east side, one on the west side, and Texas.
Well, I thought there was at least.
I thought those were the two main ones.
There was at least 5.
Texas is special.
Yeah, but Texas has its own, which they're very Texas is very special. So we've got the efficiency stuff we can do in the 80s and can still easily do right now. I just look at the SUV obsession in the United States.
If America took a notion for smaller cars, a lot of that could be easily brought down.
Yeah. Oh God. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and we're actually getting to a crisis point because these cars are now so large that they are.
Well, I think the Cybertruck, even though it's not a gasoline vehicle, is just enormous.
It's very big, but I'm thinking more of just these GMC trucks with these massive grills to the point where they're now murdering children at a very high rate.
Oh, yeah. It's hard to see because they're so high up there. I know there's like a weird thing where they're classified as like construction equipment when they're not.
So pedestrians, not just children, are dying at much higher rates now because of these stupid, worthless trucks. There's a lot of scope for what we did in the 80s, some regulatory changes. There is the shale boom, which now these folks have actually figured out how to make money at much lower prices. So, I mean, the Saudis famously tried to kill shale in 2014, but, earlier on with too low prices, and they've actually created an even worse monster coming for them. So, efficiency, shale thing. We haven't even talked about the renewable boom, which is really just EVs and renewables. It's only just starting.
So, I think I mentioned it before, but like America can pull up the drawbridge all at once on these Chinese electric cars. Like I've seen a thing they were selling electric scooters to Cuba. They're just selling them in the Americas, which is considered to be America's backyard. They'll sell them to Europe. They'll sell them to Africa. Like, it's like the rest of the world will just be a bit like, oh, I don't really need as much oil anymore.
Yeah, no, so efficiency, shale, renewables, massive solar is exponential. I did a whole live talking about that about a month ago. Insane. And then they just keep finding oil that's really easy to access everywhere.
And then the technology they've developed over the past century also makes it easier and cheaper to get.
Yeah, and I think I want to, end at the same place we began, which is in those sort of...
And China.
Yes, and China, yes, creating solar...
It's the fact it just doesn't need as much. It sort of maybe hit as peak oil in their own way.
Yeah. So I want to close sort of where we started, which is with those sort of Trente Glorieuses, that incredible 30-year period after World War II, where everybody had energy that just got cheaper, and we're there now. We're going to hopefully stay there if we can avoid a big war between the U.S. and Iran.
Which would be nice.
But it's really only war between the U.S. and Russia, U.S. and Iran, that could stop us from living back in those miracle decades after World War II. And it's not just going to be the U.S. and Western Europe benefiting from it. It's the entire planet. So it's actually kind of a happy story where the oil price doesn't matter anymore, and that's what we've tried to tell today.
I was just going to do one little caveat, which is if India takes off in the same way, let's say India takes off similar to China, it's definitely going to be a lot more renewable focused. It's not going to have the same sort of bubble up. It'll be like, oh, great, we've just got super cheap wind turbines now, okay.
And the thing is, because it's certainly rude, it's certainly regretted, lamented by oil executives and all manner of business executives. But the fact that India's rise is so much slower than China's means that India is going to be able to benefit. Its slower rise is going to be a cleaner rise. There is a real downside, is that we are not talking about emissions falling. We're talking about emissions plateauing, which is nice, but they're plateauing at a way too high level. So we're not talking about solving climate change, but we are talking about a truly, truly miraculous new era of energy abundance that will hopefully give us the wealth we need to actually solve these climate problems. But yeah, fundamentally, I think this is actually kind of an optimistic episode, Rory. Imagine that.
We accidentally did it. It only took us 100 episodes, but we got there.
Exactly. Yeah, we got an optimistic episode.
So,
I'm happy about
thank you very much for listening, and I hope you catch us next time with all your cheap electricity. Ciao, ciao.
Indeed.
The More Freedom Foundation is also available on YouTube and TikTok. Rob's Twitter is RobOLaw, and he's also written a book called Avoiding the British Empire, What It Was and How the US Can Do Better. And music provided by Kevin MacLeod.